Welcome to the Second Reading Podcast from the University of Texas at Austin.
The Republicans were in the Democratic Party because there was only one party.
So I tell people on a regular basis, there is still a land of opportunity in America. It's called Texas.
The problem is, these departures from the Constitution, they have become the norm.
At what point must a female senator raise her hand or her voice to be recognized over the male colleagues in the room?
And welcome back to the Second Reading Podcast. I'm Jim Henson, director of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin. Very happy to be joined today for something of a special off-schedule edition of the podcast by a very special guest. Jonathan Blitzer is a staff writer at the New Yorker magazine and the author of a recently published look at Greg Abbott for that publication. In the print version of the magazine, the article is titled Texas Roundup, while online it's called The Unchecked Authority of Greg Abbott. The marketer in me likes the former, while the political scientist in me likes the latter. Works both ways. John's piece is a very deeply sourced look at the arc of the governor's political career, in my view, with a focus on the intersection of Abbott's strengthening of the governor's office, the politics of what we all know now as Operation Lone Star, and changes in Texas and American politics over the last decade, if not more. John was well primed for this assignment after writing his 2024 book, Everybody Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis, which focuses on the position and experiences of migrants from the Northern Triangle of Central America in their role in the Mexico-United States border crisis that has been so central to Texas and American politics over the last 7 years. So with that, John, thanks for joining us. Really appreciate it.
No, thanks for having me.
So, in terms of disclosure, John and I were in communication while he was writing the piece. I'm briefly quoted in it. But along with a lot of other people in Texas that regular listeners of this podcast will be familiar with. So to get us kind of more substantively started, John, it seems to be that in some ways the story of Greg Abbott's political use of immigration and the border, Operation Lone Star, more or less naturally flow in a big picture way from your book, which I guess you probably finished in 2022 and then was impressed, right?
Exactly, yeah.
So talk a little bit about the from there to here, when you decided to do the Abbott piece, how it all came together, because it has a lot of components. What were you thinking going in? How did your early takes evolve or devolve along the way?
Yeah. Well, I sort of have two answers to that. The first is studying kind of the history of U.S. foreign policy, the history of U.S. immigration policy, and the politics that grow out of both from the 1980s to the present, which was in many ways the substance of the book, really primed me to look at the different ways in which lawmakers have used the immigration issue, and increasingly over the years, the border issue more specifically, to drive political outcomes. And so, obviously that's been a theme in our history from the very beginning. And is a theme, frankly, in the history of any country, kind of the use of immigration, a kind of us-them dichotomy, a fixation on law and order and a sense of borders. All of that is almost a political cliche at this point. But there really is, I think, as you start to dig into the history, an increasingly specific set of ways in which lawmakers make use of this issue, and they're kind of utilizing this as a political issue happens to take shape at around the same time as a genuine policy conundrum kind of announces itself at the U.S. southern border. And so it's kind of a perfect storm in many ways, where there's kind of endless political gamesmanship that can be done in and around this issue. And there really is a major policy problem that the U.S. government has yet to find an answer to, which is, it really most acute in 2014. And we've kind of been in this cycle ever since, which is, how do you manage American legal obligations to give people to deliver on people's right to seek asylum and to seek protection from persecution, while at the same time recognizing all of the administrative logistical hurdles therein, and of course squaring the drama at the southern border with the overwhelming need to reform the immigration system more generally, and the fact that really since 2014 we've kind of gotten in this political loop where there are broader needs that the immigration system has to have addressed, but politicians increasingly point to the border as a reason really not to engage in this more thoroughgoing reform effort. And so we're kind of stuck in this cycle. So, in many ways, Greg Abbott fits very naturally in this broader history, but I can tell you most specifically, there was a concrete moment in which I felt like, as a journalist reckoning with these issues, I had to come to Texas and had to make sense of Greg Abbott's sort of policy and politics on the issue. And that was not even in 2022 when the busing to blue cities started, although that was obviously a huge moment across the country, when the governor started busing recently arrived migrants to cities like New York and Chicago and Denver and Boston and Washington, D.C. But I was actually at the start of 2024, just coincidentally at the same time that my book was coming out, I was profiling Alejandro Mayorkas, who was then the Secretary of Homeland Security under Biden. And I have to say, almost every conversation I had in Washington, so I was reporting that story primarily in Washington. That was not a story that I did along the U.S.-Mexico border. This was more of a kind of insider's look on kind of the policy and political issues in Washington. But every conversation led back to Greg Abbott, to the extent that, people in Mayorkas's inner circle and very high up in the Biden administration all said to me, look, more than Donald Trump, the person who has really weaponized this issue in ways that are unprecedented and in ways that we're really going to be living with for years to come is Greg Abbott. And that was really, I think, what started my interest in all of this. And of course, at around that time, Greg Abbott was adopting increasingly confrontational policies to try to draw the U.S. government into this showdown over the issue. And so it all kind of cohered from there. And so I was very eager to get to Texas and to spend more time trying to understand kind of the nuts and bolts of his policy and how he thought through this stuff politically.
So when you got here, you started talking to people, when you started spending more time here, I'm wondering, how, if you were, you've got a lot of experience reporting on this issue from a lot of different perspectives. I'm wondering, once you got here, how much you were surprised, how much it was confirmatory what you saw. And I say that very conscious of, something you've probably encountered now. The Texans want to be at the center of the story. And there was, something about that I think was very evident and made it hard on the ground to interpret some of Abbott's actions in the beginning. So I'm just curious, what it was like once you got here, what met your expectations, what didn't?
Yeah, it's a great question. I will say the thing that I found most overwhelming from the start was spending time in the borderlands, in places like Del Rio, places that will be obvious to your listeners as being kind of the sort of this main fronts of what was this crisis through 2022 and 2023 and early 2024. And I was overwhelmed by the degree to which local Democrats really felt abandoned by the federal administration. This is the kind of thing where, as a reporter, you can kind of see some of the ways in which this breaks down. So, even as I was working on that Mayorkas story at the start of 2024, I'm essentially working on it in late 2023 into 2024. I was aware of the fact, and this is as someone who spends a lot of time covering immigration issues, that the busing program that the governor of Texas had set into motion is in certain ways not so dissimilar from what a more progressive-minded administration would want to do to deal with an acute policy problem at the border, which is to say, when you have a large number of people arriving, overwhelming local resources, there's a very specific need to relieve pressure at the border, and to do so by sending people who've recently arrived to cities where there are more resources, where there are more legal resources, where there are more housing resources, where the kind of politics in general are able to absorb the influx of more people. And so there is a universe in which, without Governor Abbott in the picture, the federal government does something that looks a lot like what the governor did. And so that was something that I was really kind of picking apart in my piece on Mayorkas, was trying to understand inside the administration, okay, were there dissenting voices here? Were there people inside the Biden administration, whether at the Department of Homeland Security or at the White House, saying, look, we have to steer into this issue. The politics seem bruising to us, and so our inclination politically is to look away or to claim that this isn't really a crisis or to try and find ways of minimizing the news. But there was a vocal contingent that ultimately got overruled inside the Biden administration that essentially said, look, we need to do some sort of busing ourselves. And where Governor Abbott is not coordinating with local and federal authorities, and that's very much the political gambit that he's undertaken, we need to do it precisely with such coordination, and that will bring more order to how this situation plays out. And I will say, as kind of a fun addendum, which didn't appear in the piece, there was even, as part of this kind of contingence argument inside the Biden administration, there was even an idea to publicly thank Governor Abbott for initiating this policy, and in so doing, sort of to defang this politically. They thought, the people who proposed this idea thought, look, if we're really looking to throw a curveball to someone like Abbott, who has all of this momentum right now, maybe what we do is we sort of side with him in a certain sense and say, look, thank you for starting to deal with this problem. We'll take it from here. We'll work with you on the issue. Of course, that was overruled because that was just seen as politically too risky. So I had a sense of a lot of this stuff kind of on a policy level. But what I hadn't kind of reckoned with was what it looked like on the ground for local Democrats. And of course, after the 2024 election, some of the results of the federal government's inattention to this problem were just, readily apparent. Republicans made huge gains in places where they typically struggled, where Democrats typically held strongholds. And so hearing local Democrats basically describe being caught between a rock and a hard place here, having real problems on their hands, and yet not really feeling like they can go to the federal government or get the kind of sufficient backing of the federal government. And on the other hand, knowing full well all of the ways in which Governor Abbott was making political use of this issue, they're being, on the one hand, divided against themselves and thinking, oh, we don't want to play into these, Republican politics in the state. But on the other, seeing an opportunity to get an infusion of resources from the state. So that was something that I found incredibly striking. And the second thing with that, not to answer too long here, but the second thing I'll say with that is...
No, please, go on.
I spent a lot of time speaking with border shelter operators in parts of West Texas. And obviously now they're on the receiving end of what I think is actually a vile political campaign to make it seem like they're somehow engaged in unlawful conduct, when in fact, shelter operators are kind of the lifeblood of the U.S. immigration system, precisely because the federal government has kind of washed its hands of any responsibility for dealing with people once they're released from federal custody at the border. So anyway, border shelter operators I have a great deal of sympathy and respect for, and feel like right now they're getting villainized for entirely cynical reasons. But speaking to a number of them, what was most striking to me, and this was particularly the case in Del Rio, was their sense, at least initially, of their belief that the government of Texas, the governor's office, was engaging in the busing policy in a serious way. I live in New York. My mayor, who's maybe not the country's most trustworthy political operator, was saying from the start that, Abbott wasn't telling anyone, that he was busing people, with the kind of most malevolent design and all the rest. And I think that there was a good deal of cynicism in the governor's policy not to coordinate with Democrats across the country. But on the receiving end of it all, there was kind of this assumption all along that the governor was deliberately manipulating people. And when Ron DeSantis in Florida infamously flew a bunch of migrants from San Antonio to Martha's Vineyard, having very deliberately misled them about what was waiting for them on the other side of that flight, that kind of confirmed in liberal America's mind that any and all busing related efforts were deeply cynical and were kind of unrigorous in their execution. And yet, when you speak to people around the governor, and more importantly, when you speak to shelter operators who could describe what the first days of the busing policy looked like, you came away with the very distinct impression that whatever you may feel about the governor's politics on the issue of immigration, there was a great deal of forethought about how the governor was going to go about this busing operation, making sure that people did know where they were going, getting waivers signed, coordinating with local shelters to make sure certain baseline conditions were met. There was real intelligence there. And I think it's important to reckon with that.
Now, I could be wrong about, there's a bunch I want to pick up on that. I could be wrong about this, and my friends in the Texas Press Corps will no doubt let me know immediately if I am. But it did seem to me when I read your piece that the passage in which you talked about the shelter operator in Del Rio, Tiffany Burrow, I think was her name, and her comments about coordinating and actually bargaining, in a sense, with the Abbott team, that seemed to be the first time I had read that. And it was a real important part of understanding the puzzle. I was saying a few minutes ago that when this first started happening, there was a certain amount of what exactly is going on here? Yeah. Because it was pretty clear that, there had been busing going on, not supported directly by the state. I think Henry Cuellar in Laredo was one of the, and of course Cuellar's in his own political position and all this. Right. But Henry Cuellar in Laredo said early on in this, this is great. We're already sending 20 buses a day from Laredo. More power to you if you do it correctly. And I think it really does bring out something important about Abbott, about that situation, that, you talked about the liberal response to this, but also the fact that it was both, right, in terms of the cynicism and the political leverage they gained from it. But you really do underline the argument that they didn't go at this completely haphazardly. There was coordination. There was discussion with people that they didn't really, to my memory, the Abbott team was not particularly public in saying that they were having those conversations. Those were not, big parts of the press releases. And we were seeing that even at the public level in polling. As you were describing all that, as I was reading the piece, I was recalling that when we did statewide polling for the UT Texas Politics Project poll, and we asked about busing, I had questions from folks about, there seems to be a large minority of Democrats that when you ask do you approve or disapprove of the policy, seem to approve of it. And I didn't have the direct kind of evidence that you present here, but I said, look, for some Democrats, no doubt, this seems like the right thing to do. And it's not just people in the border communities, though certainly there it probably seemed like the right thing to do, but it's also from just a general liberal perspective, it does seem like you're helping people, since this is a normal thing that people need when they cross the border, is to get somewhere else. So I think all that, was a really interesting part of the piece that really kind of worked. So now you're on the other side of the piece. It's out. What? Maybe some of this is embedded in what you've already told me, but I'm curious what you wanted people to take away from the piece. Because it seemed like, when I look at your book, your comments about the book and some of the stuff I've read, even, the things you're explicit about in the book, you really are trying to convey something in the book. I'm wondering what you wanted people to walk away from this piece with. Yeah.
Well, that particular sequence of questions of yours is actually kind of a perfect way to set up my answer, which is, I think it's very important for me at a pitched political moment like this, like the one that we've been in, for people to kind of understand sort of operationally and on the kind of granular, on the ground level, how a lot of this stuff took shape. Because I think we live in an environment now where the kind of political outcomes obscure a lot of the kind of underlying fact patterns. And, one of the real motivations I had for doing this story was to understand precisely how the busing policy took shape. Now, obviously, this is a profile of the governor. It's bigger than just the busing question. But, personally, as someone who covers these issues, I was thinking that, this busing policy, more than anything else, vis-a-vis the immigration issue, had a kind of major political impact in 2024 and has changed fundamentally the way Democrats talk about the issue now. And so I found it really important to just spend a while trying to disentangle exactly what happened, how the idea came about, why Governor Abbott was kind of particularly well positioned to develop this idea over and above the fact that he's the governor of a border state. What the kind of local players understood was happening as it was happening. Those are the people who understand these dynamics best. And so, for one thing, I'm very glad to hear that you felt that time in Del Rio with Tiffany Burrow was so instructive, because for me it was revelatory. And I'm sure people, advocates and journalists in Texas had a better insight into this than I did. I'm coming in from the outside, but just hearing her kind of anatomize what this looked like. I mean, I was fascinated to know, okay, what was the first conversation like that you had with the Department of Emergency Management, for instance, in the spring of 2022? Like, how is this idea even broached? How did this idea even become a kind of policy objective for the governor's office? And once you zero in on things like this, you can actually really start to untangle a lot of policy complexity and political complexity. But for instance, one of the incredible things about Abbott's office going to this shelter and asking for its cooperation. I mean, think about what that means to begin with, given the politics. This is not a governor who telegraphs any sort of kind of willingness to cooperate or engage with shelter operators along the border. This is a governor whose whole political brand is built around the fact that he's going to kind of say, this is how we're doing it. I'm going to execute. Anyone who's in my way, I'm going to bulldoze. But in fact, because of the way migrant arrivals work at the southern border, the governor of Texas, the governor of one of the most powerful states in the country, needs actually the cooperation of a tiny shelter in a place like Del Rio, because the federal government, when it releases people it's apprehended, only releases them to certain shelters. And so, amazingly, given all of these kind of political pyrotechnics around the issue, you still need to have an envoy from the governor quietly reach out to a shelter operator and start to negotiate some of the nuts and bolts of this policy. And so, to my mind, one of the main things I wanted to get across was what that looked like. And then when you start to kind of widen the aperture around some of those questions, you get a better sense of what the governor's MO is. And I was very struck through all of this by something that one of his top advisors, Dave Carney, told me, which, again, will come as no surprise to people, but I think is instructive when you lay it next to all of these actual kind of plot points. And that is, Abbott, given his background, given his sort of professional bent and experience, is someone who is obsessed with the possibility of getting sued. And so is always, before he adopts any policy, gonna kind of work it from all of the different legal angles, even if that leaves something wanting from a moral perspective, for instance, which is my personal take. He's at least going to do the due diligence to make sure that, okay, we can't be sued for kidnapping. We can't be challenged in this way. If a court takes up a challenge to the busing program, we're standing on firm legal ground. That's something, by the way, that like a Ron DeSantis in Florida did not do, and that I think distinguishes Abbott from pretty clearly. But that's something that distinguishes Abbott as a governor. And so readers of the New Yorker are, I like to think that they kind of range across the political spectrum, but I have no illusions about who the readers of the New Yorker are fundamentally. And I think that there's a tendency among kind of center left readers and consumers of information to kind of write off the cynical politics of people like Greg Abbott as just being kind of one-dimensional. And I actually don't think it is. And I think if you want, whatever your political persuasion, if you want to have actual insight into what's happening, if you want to actually be able to fight back politically, whatever it may be, whatever your particular interest may be, you do have to understand exactly what the viewpoint is. And my concern doing this work in general is that if you're not careful, I mean, I kind of see journalism in any context, whether it's political journalism or kind of more human interest storytelling, as being a kind of radical act of empathy with the person whose story you're trying to tell. Obviously, that is poignant and much more meaningful when you're telling the stories of ordinary people whose whose lives the broader public doesn't necessarily know about. It's a much different game, obviously, when you're talking about political actors, because there's a lot of cynicism and kind of careful coordination that they're doing. And you have to be careful as a reporter not to be too gullible or too credulous of the story they're telling you. On an issue like this immigration issue, where I feel like just by virtue of how long I've spent reporting different aspects of it, I wanted to get as close as I could to the governor and to his inner circle to understand their thinking and their thought process, the sort of political dimensions they were working out, how they understood some of the policy questions. And then I was going to ping that off of reporting of my own. I wasn't just going to take what they said as, the truth, but I felt like the only meaningful way for me as someone outside of Texas trying to understand this kind of pivotal political event, the only way I could make sense of it would be to really try to go in and, to the extent possible, just listen, just understand how the governor's office operated, how he thinks, because it's undeniable, whether you like him or not, that the governor is a major player in our politics. So that was, I think, the main goal I had, was for people to come away understanding him better, knowing kind of what made him tick, understanding the arc of his career. In seeing the arc of his career, of course, you have a story of how the immigration issue has shifted, and how, Abbott, for example, as Attorney General, in the first years of his tenure as Attorney General, was someone who cast himself as a defender of undocumented immigrants who had been scammed. And that was a key priority for him in the Attorney General's office. Obviously, that started to shift. And so understanding that shift, beyond just saying, oh, well, look, this demonstrates some fundamental hypocrisy. Fine. I actually think it does demonstrate some fundamental hypocrisy. But beyond that, what does it mean for someone who is so conscious of his political survival to start to see that he has to position himself differently on this issue? And how does he begin to do that? I think those are the smartest and most valuable ways of unlocking what is an ongoing policy conundrum and a situation in which the politics on the issue have just seemed to become totally deadlocked in Washington.
Another thing that was really interesting about the piece was this kind of 360 view of Greg Abbott that you get from talking to the people that you did. And, as I was listening to you say that, I think particularly early in his governorship, and we might have talked about this a little bit offline, there was a real question about what Abbott was going to be about as governor, if you will, and a lot of emphasis on what was called here his judicial temperament that you're taught, that you kind of referenced to. Kudos to you for not really using that term. I don't think in the piece that became a lot very overused here, because I think to really understand it, you have to think about that not so much as a temperament as a methodology that he is about. There's a temperament piece to it, but he's a very methodical guy and very, focused on the kind of legalisms that you're talking about in that whole context. But, I can't help but think, like, you circled it. You made a big star in the notes when you got the quote from Bill Miller about Abbott. But there's a toughness to him and a real political acumen that goes with that. And I think there was a real sense of people trying to say, well, it's not this, it's that. You do a good job of capturing how it's both. And I think the Carney quote you used, contrasting him with Rick Perry, really kind of helps bring that home, and it's well used.
I have to say, one of the really fun things, and this is like kind of left on the cutting room floor of an article like this, but it was incredibly valuable to be able to sit down with someone like Dave Carney, not just because of his political experience in the state, but precisely because he worked so closely with Perry and with Abbott. And that's kind of one of the ways, for an outsider like myself, I can begin to tease out what some of the distinguishing characteristics are of Abbott. And in those conversations, the sense I got, obviously Carney never said this to me explicitly and would deny it if I suggested as much, but
we'll stipulate on the record that you're not saying he said what you're about to say.
Clearly, it's more fun to tell Rick Perry stories than Greg Abbott stories. Rick Perry's just a much more charismatic guy. He's done kind of zanier things. He's, much more personable, much more of a people person. I don't even think Abbott would deny any of these things, And so what I think was also so important for me as an outsider, I mean, I spend a lot of time reporting in Texas, but I am fundamentally an outsider through and through where Texas politics is concerned. There is this question of like, okay, here is a governor who looks about as uncharismatic and kind of vanilla and flat as a public political figure can be. And yet he's about to be the longest serving governor in Texas, and this is a guy who has kind of run the table on his opponents. He has been, I think I say at a certain point, he's basically come as close to political invincibility as any politician can. And so, what does that mean? We're kind of, as a writer, I see a subject who doesn't on his face seem like the world's most kind of introspective, voluble, textured person, but who nevertheless has just an undeniable authority and power and importance in the political landscape. Let's try to understand how he's worked that, because this is not someone who has a kind of typical political profile, given the dominance he's managed to pull off over such a long period of time. So that was also one of the questions, is like, how is this guy who just looks so bland and sounds so undistinguished and ordinary politically, how is he able to become this juggernaut? That's I think another big question in all of this.
Yeah, I mean, it's going to be the question about this period in the state, I think, for those who pay attention to the institutional arc of politics in the state. Because another thing I really liked about the piece is the way you did capture that one part of the answer to that question has been his ability, those around him, to leverage this methodology, if you will, I was talking about earlier, to strengthen not only his personal political position, but to strengthen the office of the governor. And that's where the continuity is. That's one of the few areas of continuity between he and Perry, and that Perry kind of started that project. But the aspects of Abbott's toolkit and his personality you're talking about really enabled him to deepen that strengthening of the office and to leverage the political power that came from that in a really important way that's going to change the shape of the state's politics and the state's institutions going forward. I mean, there's just no two ways about that in my mind, unless, the person who succeeds him is just, fundamentally incompetent, lets it all go to hell, and that happens.
Right. It's funny you should say that, because that was one of the points, I say it sort of at the top of the piece explicitly, and I felt a bit self-conscious in the rest of the piece that there wasn't an obvious kind of way in which to anatomize exactly how he's consolidated so much power in the governor's office. It was one of those things where, when I spoke to you for the piece, when I spoke to other people who are really versed in state politics, the through line in all of those conversations is the fact that he had a fundamental kind of vision and strategy for strengthening this office, and that's above all what's so unprecedented about his tenure as governor. It's very hard to narrate that because it's an incredibly wonky story.
Yeah.
And so, it's like you end up having a reader feel like, well, right, I get it. So sure, in 2018, he insisted that he has the authority to, revise rulemaking at state agencies. And, it's like, that's a huge moment, obviously. And I spent a great deal of time researching that and interviewing people about that. But on the page, to a general interest reader, it's a little bit of a head scratcher. But I think, one thing that really struck me, and I think you and I even discussed this while I was reporting the piece, the pandemic really changed so much, obviously in every facet of American life, but in terms of how a governor like Abbott exercises political power. One of the, I think, key takeaways that I got from conversations and from kind of studying this, and other people have done exceptional reporting on the subject. I'm late to this story. The degree to which Abbott saw the opportunity of the pandemic to use emergency declarations and disaster declarations to expand his flexibility and power without being checked or muzzled by the legislature or by the courts. And that's a trend that obviously we've seen worldwide. And I have to say, the person it made me think of and this is maybe a controversial comparison because this person is is an actual Latin American strongman, but he remains in the news, is the president of El Salvador, Nayib Bukele, who I had profiled a few years back in kind of 2022 was when I did a lot of that reporting. And it was a similar story in that you had someone who, if you looked at the arc of his career, you could see, as you could with Abbott, someone who was a real student of political power and who was very conscious of finding ways within the political system of amassing power and kind of translating that power in very visible public displays of political success. And one of the things that really struck me reporting on Nayib Bukele in El Salvador was that the pandemic for him was the real turning point. That's when he was able to say, okay, I'm going to start declaring different versions of a state of exception that suspend ordinary checks on my authority. And in the moment, it seemed wholly justified because we were dealing with a, once in a generation pandemic that had grave public health consequences in every direction. But as a political strategy, as a governing strategy, that really became, in El Salvador, the president's MO. And in a certain sense, that also became the MO of Greg Abbott. I'm not suggesting a kind of point-to-point comparison between the two of them, but the strategy is, I have to say, remarkably similar, where all of the stuff that Abbott did vis-a-vis the border was to declare a disaster. And out of that disaster declaration, which, by the way, remains ongoing, just as in El Salvador, a state of exception declared in 2022 has been renewed every month since then. It's that kind of permanent state of crisis that begins with a moment that does seem legitimately sort of crisis worthy, but which subsequently starts to get watered down and becomes a pretext. And that, I think, is a major thing that Abbott has pioneered. And if you look at it, the president of the United States is actually, in many ways, rhetorically following Abbott's lead in terms of declaring a state of invasion and using that as the basis for all of these extraordinary executive authorities. So that's, I think, an important part of the story, too, in terms of understanding how he's taken an office which historically, compared to this office in other states, isn't terribly strong. You've got a competing presence in the lieutenant governor's office. You've got kind of an odd arrangement with the state legislature and so on. So the question is how he's turned an office that has not been, historically this instrument of great political power into something that really is kind of unchallengeable. I think that's a big part of understanding him and what's to come.
That's the peak example of what we've been, circling or, kind of probing into, which is this combination of a very hard-headed institutionalism and a very close understanding of the tools offered within the law and within the system, and coupled with the political acumen and the will, if you will, to exploit that for political ends. And, watching that unfold, there was, a very interesting kind of adaptation as the pandemic unfolded nationally, but the way it unfolded here. I mean, you can really, if you look at Abbott's job approval ratings in state polling, we were polling pretty frequently during that period. And since then, you can basically see Abbott's numbers go up in the early stages of the pandemic and then begin to fall among Republicans as the politics of the pandemic begin to, become more polarized, and then go back up as he adapts to that. And so there's this interesting combination there of the adaptation to what was, I think you remind us all, was a very uncertain time in how we made these kinds of judgments. But, he made those decisions that you're talking about in terms of this institutional move toward the state of emergency and the way that you can accumulate authority and then keep it amidst a lot of uncertainty in that period.
Yeah. Yeah. And, you made this point to me over the course of my reporting, and several other people whose judgment on this stuff I really respect also made a version of this point, which was, that period in 2020, on the eve of his 2022 reelection bid, when he faces primary challenge from the right, from two other, candidates, neither of whom on his own has much of a shot of doing really anything, of doing any real damage to Abbott, but who kind of collectively represent to Abbott this threat of, drifting or sagging approval on the right. And that is something that I think also speaks to his personality, that, whereas some people would see these two, sort of irrelevant far right challengers in a primary as like a kind of nuisance to be brushed off, he recognizes in them not an immediate challenge to his primacy, but a kind of symbolic threat to what he is and what he represents. And so his approach to that is to swallow their positions whole, which is actually quite an incredible response. He ends up absorbing a lot of their positions himself, and in so doing, of course, obliterates them and also sets the stage for his next big political project, which is one of the ways in which I've understood the push for vouchers that we see in 2023 as emerging essentially out of this period where, it feels funny to say, it feels funny to narrate, certainly to a national audience, that this guy who basically seems unrivaled every time he runs for the governorship felt maybe as vulnerable as he ever felt politically in that office in 2022, immediately after the pandemic, partly as a result of just how chaotic the politics of the pandemic were and how much discontent that kind of rustled up on the right, which is obviously the only zone of the political spectrum that Abbott has to be particularly attentive to. So, that understanding kind of how he processed the pandemic and how he kind of moved forward from that period of uncertainty is, I also think, a key to unlocking how he's operating now, several years later.
You mentioned earlier on, and it really got to something I was going to open up, and I just kind of passed it on, but I'll go back to it a little bit, that, 2014 is actually an interesting pivot year in that dynamic, because the year that Abbott is elected is the same year that Lieutenant Governor Dan Patrick is elected. And it seems like an eon ago, but that dynamic of Abbott being ever attentive to the potential for challenges from the right really was present from the very beginning. Patrick epitomized that for a long time. So, in the years between 2014 really up to even through the pandemic, and it was manifest during the pandemic as well, the big guessing game here was whether Patrick was going to challenge Abbott. And so that was fueling that. And I think at a certain level, that 2022 primary, the caution in not underestimating the more marginal challengers that year was a cultivated wariness of what was going on the right. And, that just peaked at that point. And by that point, it was becoming, I think, a little more apparent that Patrick was not likely to challenge Abbott. But if you talk to people that were present during the period of, kind of Abbott, Strauss, Patrick unstable triangle that you touch on in the piece briefly, that was one of the driving dynamics of that. And I think you're right to tie that to what's going on when 2022 rolls around. I don't want to keep you too much longer, but I do want to end by kind of telescoping back out. I'd feel remiss to not ask you, given your expertise here, as I look on my phone at the midsection of the New York Times homepage, 3 stories right in a row, 3 headlines: with deportations, Trump steps closer to showdown with judicial branch. Next one, White House denies violating judge's orders and deporting Venezuelans. Third headline below that, Brown University professor is deported despite a judge's order. We were talking about this before we started recording, but I want to circle back and end on this. You've done a lot of reporting for the book in this, and we've talked a lot about this judicial temperament. I think you have a lot of thoughts, and you've reported a lot on the role of judicial system in immigration policy, but I think it now telescopes out in this moment to the role of the judiciary in the larger state of play right now with the Trump administration. I'm wondering, as you look at these headlines this morning, and they're pretty new, and I know you probably don't have a ton of time to think about them, like what are your thoughts on this and where this goes next?
In some ways, being in the trenches reporting on the first Trump administration gave me a kind of special window into some of the things we're seeing now, because the kind of brazenness now and the sense of unaccountability that you're just seeing kind of out in the open right now was first tested during the first Trump administration. And the zone of policy where it was tested during that first term was on immigration. That's kind of been the sort of vanguard for a lot of what Trump's kind of wildest ideas about executive authority kind of tend to play out. And so one of the things that I was told during the first Trump term by people high up in the Trump administration was that they had a special approach to nationwide injunctions, to courts basically intervening and saying, okay, we have to halt this particular policy because it's unlawful. And until we have time to weigh the kind of different facets of this policy on the merits, we are suspending this, whatever initiative it was. Inside the Trump administration during the first term, there was an evolving sense of how to respond to those things. Initially, it was met with just great frustration and hand-wringing. And Trump got angry at his first Attorney General, Jeff Sessions, felt like he wasn't doing enough, for example, with the initial travel ban to fight it in the courts. The Attorney General's hands were tied. They kind of kept going back to the drawing board, trying to water down the travel ban so that it would pass legal muster. Eventually they did, but that to Trump felt like a kind of political loss, even though eventually it was a success because they managed through kind of all sorts of legal tweaking to get through the policy they wanted. But in the kind of power politics that matters to Trump, which is all that matters to Trump, this idea of sort of flouting authority from other branches to shore up his own is kind of front and center. And what you started to hear in the kind of middle years of the first Trump term, I'm thinking 2018, 2019, was that Stephen Miller, Trump's now senior advisor and at the time top immigration advisor, would tell people in the administration, look, let's just charge ahead with our policies. And sure, we'll get enjoined in a federal court. But first of all, the courts are slow and we can operate decisively and swiftly. And as the courts kind of slowly churn through their reviews, we can charge ahead with our policies. And secondly, we are every day appointing more and more judges to the federal judiciary. And so if we lose in a federal court that's friendlier to democratic challenges, we'll win at the appellate level. And we'll even win at the Supreme Court level if we have to. So let's not slow down based on any sense of judicial checks or resistance. The actual strategy is to speed up through them. Because that only proves our decisiveness and it only reveals how sclerotic the court system ultimately is to check a president's agenda. And so it doesn't surprise me that here we are in the second term where members of this administration feel like they have a mandate they never had before, doing all sorts of things that legally are completely radical, if not overwhelmingly unlawful. But this game that they're playing, essentially playing chicken with federal judges and saying, okay, well, you said that we had to turn this plane full of Venezuelans around. Sorry, the plane already left. You see, I think there was an Axios report I read yesterday where you had two people inside the administration speaking. One was very clearly Stephen Miller, and another was some other sort of nominally more kind of bureaucratic voice. The nominally more bureaucratic voice said, listen, we're not trying to challenge a judge. The bottom line is these deportation flags were already in the air when the judge issued his ruling. It was just out of our hands at that point, which is, factually inaccurate, but was nevertheless the kind of feint toward reasonableness that every once in a while you see from Trump's inner circle. The other voice quoted in the Axios story was very clearly Stephen Miller's saying, what right does a judge have to tell us how to run immigration policy? Which is, the actual unvarnished view of how people in Trump's inner circle see this. And they're going to fight this to the last. And so I don't know, I leave it to the legal scholars to sort out kind of what the questions are for the rule of law. It certainly seems to me to be unprecedented territory. An administration basically getting a very clear judicial order and simply ignoring it, and actually making a show of ignoring it. And it's now happening with a frequency and an undeniability that you can't explain away. That, I think, is as grave and scary as it gets. And it always starts with immigration-related things, because to be frank, there isn't a clear domestic political constituency for asylum seekers in the United States. It's very easy in raw political terms for an administration like this one to say, oh, well, these Venezuelans that we've apprehended, they have ties to a Venezuelan gang. Trust us. We're not going to show you any evidence. We have no need to show evidence, but it's enough for us to summarily deport them. And we're going to deport them now, as we've seen, in contravention of a judicial order. Who's going to speak up for the people who are now put in this impossible position? These migrants who are accused of unspeakable crimes that many of them have not committed. We saw it, for example, in the first batch of people who were flown to Guantanamo Bay. The administration said initially, all of these people are gang members associated with a Venezuelan gang called Tren de Aragua. And then when there was actual legal pressure applied to the situation, lawsuits filed, a judge starting to weigh, the circumstances, the government eventually admitted, oh, right, of the 177 Venezuelans we just flew to Guantanamo, where we're holding some of them in the same cells that were used for Al-Qaeda suspects in, the early 2000s, it turns out 51 of them had no criminal records. Oops. It's the kind of thing where with any amount of scrutiny, you can pierce any of the administration's arguments. But who is going to mount this kind of scrutiny? Certainly the Democrats right now are scared to take this fight on. And so the people you have are, people who believe in, progressive immigration policy, people who believe in the rule of law. I wish the constituency politically were broader in terms of people who would really let out a huge outcry over what's happening. But I think one of the reasons why the Trump administration can get away with things like this, or at least feels that it can, is because who's going to come out and fight? There isn't, right now the Democrats are in total disarray. And so there's, on this issue above all, on the immigration issue above all, and then more specifically within the immigration issue, on the subset of asylum-related issues of people who have come to the United States seeking protection, seeking relief, who've arrived through the border, who've arrived through a policy created during the Biden years to try to alleviate pressure at the border. There's really, I think, a sense of, well, no one is really challenging us here on these issues, on the values or on the merits of them. So if we're going to expand presidential authority, this is the best laboratory that exists to us, because we can do it the most brazenly and see what happens. And so that's what we're in right now. And I find it to be an incredibly scary moment.
Yeah, I think I couldn't agree more in terms of the connection between this testing of the boundaries of separation of powers and, their ability to defy the judiciary, and the way that immigration and border issues are the best place for them to do that. Not only are the Democrats sort of, on their heels and have their own, as I was saying earlier, and we were talking about their own divisions in their base, there is just such unity among Republican voters, and even more so than among Republican elites, on these restrictive views of abortion, of immigration and the border, the ability to, the willingness to tie immigration to criminality, that there's no source of pushback either within their base or outside. I think that's right.
And I have to say, just by way of concluding, one of the big reasons, if you ask me, why Democrats right now are in such disarray. Obviously, they've never been great on immigration issues because there's too much variance inside the caucus and competing interest groups and uncertain policy approaches and so on. But the reason, I think, above all, why Democrats right now are the most reluctant to speak up on immigration issues has to do with the consequences of Abbott's busing. I think you basically have in states like New York, in states like Illinois, in states like Colorado, Massachusetts, the voices of strong resistance to Trump's first-term immigration agenda are now very muted because they were politically blindsided by the consequences of Abbott's busing, and as a result have this attitude. And this is, to be clear, this isn't my analysis. This is what I'm told by, senior congressional staffers, that, well, the public has voted. The public has spoken. Trump's 2024 election enunciates as clearly as we're willing to admit that, like, the public has grown increasingly hostile to immigrants and to immigration generally. And as a result, we have to tread lightly. That's the thinking in Democratic circles, which I think is incredibly dangerous and wrongheaded. But what unleashed that was the political consequences of Abbott's busing, which just is to reiterate his central role in the current moment.
Way to tie it all together. John, thanks so much for taking the time to join us today, and for the great piece. I appreciate both, and, keep in touch.
Oh, it's such a pleasure. Thanks for having me.
We've been talking with Jonathan Blitzer about his piece in the March 17th, 2025 issue of The New Yorker, and on the New Yorker website about Greg Abbott and Texas in the age of the Trump-led GOP and its implications for a lot of different things, but particularly immigration politics. You should also look for Jonathan's excellent 2024 book, Everybody Who Is Gone Is Here, The United States, Central America, and the Making of a Crisis. As always, thanks to our excellent audio production team in the Dev Studio here in the College of Liberal Arts at UT Austin. Thanks to you all for listening. Keep an eye out. We'll be back soon with another Second Reading podcast from the Texas Politics Project. The Second Reading podcast is a production of the Texas Politics Project at the University of Texas at Austin.